welcome to this week's episode of Wide Angle. The year kicked off, in fact, on New Year's Day with President Donald Trump tweeting very early in the morning DC time about Pakistan, how it was a country full of deceit and lies, how they had taken billions of dollars in aid from the United States and not given anything in return. A tweet that obviously was music to India's ears. But really, with these proclamations coming out of Washington every few months, what do these statements reflect? Do they reflect policy changes on the ground? Should India be reacting to these in the moment as welcoming of these statements, or should there be a longer view about what changes could really be affected on the ground? To discuss this further, we're joined by Professor Happymon Jacob of Jawaharlal Nehru University, who has just returned from a visit to the Pakistani side of the line of control, and Bharath Gopalaswamy of the Atlantic Council, who runs the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Professor Jacob, I want to start by asking you first your impressions. You went to the other side of the line of control, manned by the Pakistani army. What were your impressions? What have you brought back in terms of experiences, narratives, stories from that side?
Thank you, Maya, for asking that question. I think one thing that stands out very clearly on the other side of the line of control is that the Pakistan army is under great pressure. From the Indian side, they have fewer people stationed there, they have fewer weapons, they have very little patrolling, and the last couple of years the Indian side has been really upping the ante and increasing the firepower using artillery and mortars. Not that the other side is not doing that, even they are doing it, but given the sheer numerical inferiority, there is a great deal of worry among the forces on the line of control, and this has also led to a lot of destruction of the civilian habitats in POK, and because the Pakistani side has population living up to the zero line, unlike the Indian side. And therefore there's a great deal of pressure, and there is a great amount of willingness to go in for confidence building measures with India, like withdrawing heavy weapons from the zero line of control, etc., etc. I think that's one thing that stands out very clearly. The second aspect I thought was that was completely unmissable was the China factor. There is talk about China just about everywhere. You go to the trading points along the line of control, be it Chakoti, be it Titri Note, from there to the CGS, the Chief of General Staff in Rawalpindi at the GHQ. Everyone has one thing to say, and that is China is going to make things better for us. In terms of infrastructure, in terms of economic development, in terms of geopolitical sort of placing of Pakistan in South Asia. I think there's a feeling that China is the new game. China is probably the only game in Pakistan at this point of time.
That's an interesting comment, and I want to bring you in on that, Bharath Gopalaswamy, because in response to President Trump's tweets and statements and the cutting back of over $200 million in aid in the first week of January alone, many senior ministers and diplomats from Pakistan have said, well, the Americans should know that we always have China to fall back on, kind of reflective of what he's saying he got in terms of a message. What is the rationale, if there is a rationale in Washington, about these proclamations about Pakistan, and is there a strategy that's being followed? Because if Pakistan is saying that they have China to fall back on, what happens in DC?
Well, I think what happens in DC is what's been happening on this. Is not the first time that the Pakistanis have raised the China talk or the Russia talk. This is something that they keep raising. They keep raising the blackmail and the coercion about the logistical supply routes to Afghanistan. So all these things, what would the Pakistanis say? Essentially, they've been named and shamed in a tweet. The United States officials have been saying these things about Pakistan in a very sophisticated manner until the previous administration. For the first time, Donald Trump has called a spade, made it very public, named and shamed them. And what you see from the Pakistanis and the reactions from the Pakistani officials is something where naming and shaming works, actually. And we've observed that the naming and shaming has embarrassed them in an international arena, calling them out for sheltering people like bin Laden,
Hafiz Saeed, as far as the
Hafiz
Indians are
Saeed.
concerned as well.
And what kind of a brazen message is when you make, when Hafiz Saeed is released from prison and he comes out, sermonizes, and there are talks about mainstreaming him into a political party. What is the kind of message that you are sending? When the United States sends such a message, that surprises them. But when the Pakistanis do the same thing, and they expect not to be surprised by a message coming in counter to their actions, we should ask the same questions to the Pakistanis too. So I think that's what the United States has done the first time. The key questions for many of the analysts and the experts in the Beltway or the United States policymakers is, how far is the United States willing to go?
Right.
What are the next steps? Can this be sustainable? And can this provide the kind of reactions that we are looking for?
Right. And I think that's always the question, that when Delhi reacts and welcomes comments like this, in August when President Trump announced the South Asia policy as well, there was finally sort of a sigh in Delhi saying that, okay, now they get what we're talking about. But now they get what we're talking about is something Delhi has felt on several different occasions. I mean, starting from 9/11, when the 9/11 attacks happened, Jaswant Singh as minister went to Washington and finally found an audience for what India had been talking about regarding terrorism. So, the Pakistani military and their story and their narrative on the line of control is one thing. The China factor is another thing. But this kind of dealing with the United States, as difficult as it may be for the US perhaps to extricate itself from an intertwined, intense Pakistan relationship, it's also difficult for Pakistan to make good on these threats, in a sense, to say, let the US go do what they want, we've got China.
That is true. I mean, it is interesting that despite the geopolitical rivalry between United States and China, Pakistan has been managing both the sides, and in a sense reaching out to both sides, both to Beijing and Washington, and has so far been successful in trying to cater to their needs and sort of make use of these two major powers in the region. But I think with the new administration in Washington, Pakistan's ability to maneuver these two sides to their own interests is going to be very little. And I think that's going to be the big hit for the generals in Rawalpindi in many ways. Now, how are they going to manage that? I think they will try and talk out of the situation like they have done in the past. I think, even from Washington, there is no one clear message coming to South Asia. Is Mattis talking along the same lines as Mr. Trump? Probably not. Mattis is talking about the need to discuss this. There are difficulties, there are problems, but they have been our allies, and we go to discuss with them. So I think the picture is not as clear as we would like it to be. It's more fluid, and I think we go to wait and see how this is going to pan out in the days to come. And my own feeling is that this is not going to end as a tragic story for Pakistan. I think it's going to be more than that.
In fact, there are skeptics in India who repeatedly say this. It's one thing for the Americans to come out and make these statements. At the end of the day, they're not going to let go of this relationship so easily as well.
The Pakistani relationship,
yes,
you mean?
Yeah.
So, I'll take a bigger view of this. You mentioned the South Asia strategy. Okay, this was announced
in August.
In August of last year. Yeah, there was a South Asia strategy, but nobody is clear what that strategy is. What are the elements and components of that strategy? Who will implement that strategy? And what are the roles of the executive branch, the legislative branch, to implement that strategy? And what is the role? Is there a regional consensus within the region about buying into a U.S. strategy that involves the region? In my mind or in my observations, I haven't found a clear thinking along these lines. That's number one. The next point is then that implicitly answers your question whether is the United States willing to let go of Pakistan? And in my view, I don't think the United States should let go of whatever leverage it has with Pakistan, because at the end of the day, it's the fastest growing arsenal in the world. And it has got a deadly mix of fastest growing arsenals with the
and non-state actors with access to it.
Actors, and Christine Fair's literature, if anything, points out the growing threat of the increasing jihadi materials and the madrasa trained elements in Pakistan. So there is no reason to let go of that relationship. However, a calibration in that relationship is required, and to what degree and what level can the United States calibrate it and enforce it at the same time, and through successive administrations. And the last but not the least, the point is that the reason at some levels Pakistan is playing the China factor is precisely the point that it does not want to let go of the United States too. It knows that the United States has unique strengths, maybe not in the Asia Pacific, maybe not in the Indo-Pacific, but maybe with its European allies with whom Pakistan has its own set of relationship. And given a chance, and the Pakistanis would want to build a robust trade relationship with the United States. Consistently they've argued trade but not aid with the U.S.
Right.
So it's not that it's not that they don't they're wanting to bank on the Chinese. They're being forced into a corner where now their only sole factor is China, and there are interesting congruences between the United States and China in many of the international forums, despite their similarities too. The United States-China relationship is not focused on Pakistan alone. In geopolitical terms, maybe it is, but at the end of the day, it's an $800 billion trade relationships with deep investments in the international system as a whole. These are two big countries that cannot afford the other to fail because of the consequences to not only the global system, but to themselves as well.
Right. Okay. So taking on from that, where does India fit into this puzzle? Because we've established what the US-China relationship is, or the imperatives that drive it. We've established the imperatives that drive the US-Pakistan relationship in spite of the turbulence that we've seen. Afghanistan is a key factor. India being in the neighborhood, do you feel that India is able to leverage its geostrategic, geoeconomic location and power appropriately given these dynamics?
No, I don't think so. I think we have not really thought through this. I think at this point of time, there are several things that one needs to keep in mind when deciding what the Indian policy towards these developments should be. I think point number one, the Americans are not really concerned about India-centric terror outreach in Pakistan. They are bothered about the Haqqani network and the Pakistan Taliban. So if the Pakistanis promise to put pressure on these groups, the Americans would be pretty happy with that. So India then loses out, from an Indian national security point of view. Point number two, I think the sort of rupture in a US-Pakistan relationship will lead to sharper geopolitical competition in Southern Asia. Say on the one hand you would have countries like China, Russia and Pakistan, then you would have United States, India. What role are the Saudis going to play is something that needs to be taken on board. So this sharper geopolitical competition will somehow force India to sort of go one way or the other, and to my mind, bandwagoning one group or the other, and clearly defining that I am with this particular actor and not the other is not going to be suitable for India. India is located in the region. Pakistan is a neighbor. China is India's biggest trading partner. So you're looking at a very sort of precarious situation that India would
and
be
we're all neighbors. We're all in the region. We're all neighbors.
Absolutely, right. Absolutely. So I think, and more importantly, given the Sino-Indian rivalry, the more the Americans withdraw from the region, the more the rupture between the United States and Pakistan becomes sharper. It's going to be difficult for the Indian side to manage, at least indirectly, what happens in South Asia vis-a-vis Pakistan. So I think it is from a conflict resolution point of view, from the point of view of terrorism. So I think from a broader picture, from a broader point of view, I would say if Mr. Trump acts on what he says he would do, then it's not going to be all that hunky-dory for India. It's going to be a very complicated picture, and I think at this point of time, the best policy for India would be the Goldilocks principle. I mean, not too hot, not too cold, and sort of wait and
watch always seems to be the fallback position of any diplomatic entanglement in general. But I think taking on from that also, yes, what happens to India in this scheme is important. But as we've been seeing, in fact, even has been reported in the papers in the last few days, India is used to a certain amount of attrition from the Pakistani side along the international border, along the line of control. It's an ongoing narrative, right? Decades old. We're seeing some of that happen now on the Eastern Front as well. And that puts us into another slightly precarious position as far as China is concerned. So it's not just about how China and the US deal with each other or China and Pakistan deal with each other. It's now very much becoming about this economic security interaction, for want of a better word, between Delhi and Beijing.
That's correct. We actually today have on our hands a two-and-a-half front situation, whether we like it or not. The Chinese side is increasing the pressure, and the Pakistanis are clearly increasing the pressure. And yes, clearly the ceasefire violations and the shallow incursions, they have taken place all the time. But what is important today to be noticed is the presence of hyper-nationalism and the media, right? I mean, we have a very, very, say, active media in India today. So what happens on the line of control does not remain there. It has a certain national implication within India, and there is something happening within Kashmir also. So when you put all of this together, the possibility of what happens on the line of control escalating to a larger crisis, and then what will the Chinese play and what will the Americans say. So I think we are looking at a very, very murky situation at this point of time, and I think the Indian side would be, my own advice would be that you go in for a certain amount of confidence building with the Pakistanis on the line of control. Quieten the amount of violence that is taking place there, the amount of noise that is coming out of the line of control. You're talking about over 2,000 ceasefire violations reported by the Pakistani side last year alone, which is a high in the last 5 years, in the high actually since the ceasefire agreement was agreed to in 2003. And the deaths of competence and non-competence. So at least if you do take certain steps to reduce the violence that is taking place in various spaces, one on the Sino-Indian border, India-Pakistan border, and also reach out to the Kashmiris. I think it is important for India to look after these things so that they don't blow out of proportion. At the end of the day, as you pointed out, India is located in this region. We have no way out of it. The Americans do, we don't.
Right, and also taking on from what was said earlier, Bharath, this idea that if the Pakistanis do something as far as the groups that are operating on their Western Front, the Haqqani network or the TTP or whatever, if something is done about those insurgents, Pakistan is off the hook, at least for some time. What happens with groups that are operating in India? What happens with people like Hafiz Saeed? There are great words coming from Washington, but is there a sincerity in DC to do something about these groups as well, or will the US sit back and say, okay, they've done what we asked them to for right now?
Look, the sincerity question, I'm not going to address the sincerity question. And I'll always give the benefit of doubt. I work amongst the policy making circles in DC, and I have no doubt to believe in the sincerity of that message.
Okay.
Right? That's because I've seen that system close. And I think, but what is important to note is what is the interest here? The interest of somebody like Donald Trump is what message does he give as an American president when he goes on a rally in Kansas and he is asked by the question by the mother of a slain soldier in Afghanistan. What is the message he is going to give? And what is the victory speech that he will give? Okay,
sure,
that is an American president's view.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, he is sworn to his constitution to defend his country. And if the Haqqanis are the biggest threat to his soldiers,
then that's the priority.
That's his priority.
Right.
Hafiz Saeed, they wanted bin Laden. You talk about January 1st message, but let's go back to when we took bin Laden out. It concerned the United States' national interest. The United States deployed its assets, went and got bin Laden out, and then said, this is what we were looking for.
Right.
So even bigger than the $225 million message, Donald Trump put it in writing but these guys did it in action. The Obama administration did it in action. So, and I think if for some reason in the last 10 years, we witnessed the United States and India growing ever closer together. The U.S.-India nuclear deal, however, wherever it ended up today,
it was a huge shift.
It was a huge shift. It's a tectonic shift in geopolitics.
Right.
Right? You're allowing a country breaking the shackles of their own non-proliferation principles and bringing it in that you have built on.
No question.
No question about it. And if the Indians wanted to do something about these groups in Pakistan, I don't think the Americans will stand in the way. They may sometimes not give an endorsing statement, but they will certainly look at it the other way. They will certainly look the other way, and they'll say, we may not give you public statements, but we'll quietly back you in whatever you want to do. You ask for an armed drone. Another significant event this happened was India is the first non-NATO country to receive
weaponized drones.
Non-weaponized drones.
Non-weaponized drones, right.
You may think it's a trivial thing, that it's a technology a little bit tad too late, but remember, these are archaic laws, and working through United States' bureaucracy and Congress is not the easiest thing. Then we've been able to come so far.
Right. So that's interesting, because when the surgical strikes happened, for example, in 2016, it sort of ties into what Bharath is saying as well. The Americans will not overtly come out and do anything in support, but they will not stand in the way. Is that a message for the Indian Army?
I think the message has been understood also to some extent. Let's put it this way. When the cold start, the undeclared cold start strategy was responded to by the Pakistani side, talking about TNWs and forward deployment of nuclear weapons, etc. So the Indian Army has, in a sense, found a way to call that bluff by sort of carrying out what they call a surgical strike.
Right.
The Pakistani side basically said nothing of that kind took place, precisely because there is no way to respond to that kind of a strike, because with the superior numbers of the Indian Army, it can carry out operations within the Pakistani occupied Kashmir. And if something of that kind happens within the Pakistani occupied Kashmir, the Pakistanis are not going to respond to that using tactical nuclear weapons or even massive force. They just don't have the massive force. They just don't have the numbers. So their numerical inferiority is being used by the Indian Army, and nobody really bothered with that. The international community was quiet about it. The Americans didn't really say anything about it. So I think the Indian Army has understood that message and has been acting on that.
And even if it was a tactical move by the Pakistanis, in a sense, to leave the populations on the zero line, or to reduce the number of deployment along the line of control on the other side, to, in a sense, garner some kind of international sympathy that, look, the Indians are much stronger, and look at what our people are going through. That hasn't worked. I mean, the Pakistanis have not been able to garner, no matter what's been going on, they haven't been able to garner that kind of sympathy about the line of control as well. So, in a sense, this message has permeated somewhere, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on, to the previous point and whatever I was mentioning. My CEO came here and we discussed this. We said the U.S.-India relationship is right. It's largely a boring marriage, right? And that's at many levels defined by its extramarital affairs, China, Pakistan, and all these countries. Because India is not a cause for concern for the United States.
Right.
India is sometimes a bit of frustration for the United States.
But it's a secure relationship.
It's a secure relationship. And the frustration stems from the fact that it ranks 130 in the ease of doing business. That's the only, that is where the Indian frustration.
And the bureaucracy.
And the bureaucracy. And likewise for the Indians, the American bureaucracy. Right. And ideally, the Americans would always want the Indians to do more, play a greater role. But they've learned to live with the fact that India will come to that stage at its own pace, and the reforms will also take place at its own pace, and they just simply cannot face it. And at the end of the day, this is a 20-year-old relationship. This was, in 1998, India was a sanctioned country. Today, you're giving non-NATO, a non-NATO country this level of technology transfer.
Right.
So what people on the both sides, the United States and
India, the economic and the defense partnership going,
would like to see is the acceleration of some of these issues, So we're just frustrated with each other on some of these, at some of these levels and some of these issues. But at the end of the day, it's not a cause for concern as much as Pakistan or China is. The Indians do not have a destabilizing effect for the United States and the rest of the world.
But how does that, I think the question really is how that translates, the security of that relationship, how that translates into something beneficial on the security front for India, on the geosecurity, the national security front.
You know, where I would argue there are cases to be made across the wider Middle East. Iran is an example. Okay, there are important divergences in the way both India and the United States view Iran. Saudi Arabia, Israel, and India has been one country that has been successfully able to maneuver all these relationships that the United States has long struggled.
However, I mean, on the Afghan question, there was a time when India was very keen on participating in a dialogue process on Afghanistan with the United States and the other stakeholders. The Americans never invited India.
And that was also for a reason, which is not to upset the Pakistanis beyond a point.
That's correct. So they were currying favor with Rawalpindi and they refused to let India on board. So in a sense, and Afghanistan is a key country for India in the region.
That's what I meant, that sometimes it's largely defined by its extramarital affairs. You know, one party wants more, the other party wants them to intervene less at that point. Right? I mean, it's at that time, I think the Americans felt that they had a greater leverage in Afghanistan.
That's correct. And today, when they have no leverage, they're asking India to sort of do XYZ in Afghanistan, which Indians do not want to, because that's the correct thing to do. You go into a place where the Americans are almost tired of and want to withdraw from. Why do India want to get into that? Not at this point of time.
And I think the Indian message has been very consistent and clear and measured in whatever their roles and responsibilities as far as Afghanistan has been concerned.
So I think, we're running out of time, so I think we'll end up leaving it there. But, you know, the idea that every few weeks or few months, a statement from Washington, does it have the ability to actually make a difference on the ground? Or are they just statements that are aimed at grabbing the morning headlines or, you know, to that extent? And I think the Indians need to also therefore maybe not respond immediately as and when a statement is made, but take the big picture in its
and also observe closely what is happening in Pakistan. Are the Pakistanis going to really come under pressure because of the United States? The PML government does not want to sort of face it. They are already under pressure. They don't want to face more trouble. And in the upcoming elections, Hafizai is probably going to contest the elections. So in that kind of a situation, they are very careful.
And that's going to challenge India's response as well. If that indeed does happen, it will challenge the three-way relationship.
First of all, you have to see where the statement or the message from the United States stems from. Is it from Trump or from the establishment? You know, there are important incoherences in that. Trump may say something,
and
but Mattis may just, do what he wants.
Right.
And and Trump himself is consistently inconsistent. Right?
I think that's okay.
Yeah, and so we have to make a note of that. So take always those things, and the 3 a.m. tweets are best.
Right, take those into consideration. But nonetheless, irrespective of that, I think these are the challenges that India needs to keep in mind when it responds.
And there are also inconsistencies within the Pakistani responses too. You've had a foreign minister say something, and you've had the foreign secretary say something, right, and contradicting his own statement, or maybe there is a nuances in their own statement if you want to give them the liberty of interpreting them in a wider space. But at the end of the day, the Pakistani, whatever the civilian establishment says, you have to take with a big bucket of salt too.
Right.
Not even a grain.
Okay, and I think on that note, we'll have to end this conversation because this is an ongoing conversation. Absolutely. You've been looking at India-Pakistan for years. I've been looking at India-Pakistan for years. Bharat, that US, Pakistan, India, all three relationships, very important. We'll continue these conversations as the year carries on, but that's all on Wide Angle this week. Thank you for watching.